ask some of the questions of you. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Daryl Judd. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of a company called Logistics Executive Group. Many of you were in the room yesterday, so I won't bore you with my story. I thought there were some really interesting things that Chris just talked about there that sets us up for the next part of our morning, which is to talk about future supply chains as it relates to Asia. Chris, I'm not quite sure if I should be concerned by this or actually just about to give up now, but I think there's two things that came out for me. $1.7 trillion is market worth for Internet of Things, I think if I got that correctly. And the most important stat there wasn't actually the number, but the period of time by which that was going to occur. I think 2020, if I recall, up from 655 million. You're nodding there, so I must have those numbers right. That's a significant growth in just 5 short years. And 30 million devices connected, and it sort of leads us into what we're going to talk about now. And I apologise if we're looking over our shoulders, because unfortunately there is no monitor here, so you're just going to have to bear with us. We talked about disruptive technology. Well, we've seen no more greater act in technology than this little device here, which everybody seems to be struggling with. So I now have a new one in my pocket, and if that doesn't work, we're going to go to the virtual reality where I lift my hand and the slide just changes. We touched on job losses. Yesterday we had a wonderful panel on talent and leadership. I think we've solved our problem in terms of 50% of the jobs in supply chain being lost in primary sectors. Maybe we just need to re-educate and redeploy that talent to fix our job shortage. So certainly some significant shifts in the landscape, just picking up on some of Chris's themes. I want to touch on a couple of other ones this morning. And I'm going to rush through this reasonably quickly because I know we are all pushed for time, and quite frankly, you don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to our panel that's coming up next. And so I want to set the theme for my panellists. But I do want to talk about things like M&A and the recent consolidation, or the increase in activity that's taking place around our sectors. We read the headlines every day. I want to talk about this thing called the Asia era. And I want to recap on some of the views of the panellists and presenters yesterday that talked about some of the shifting landscapes in Asia. One of which, of course, is free trade agreements and how they impact us, particularly for countries like Singapore and Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, where there are overlapping bilateral trade agreements which are now coming to fruition. AEC being one of those, TPP being another, RECP being another, the acronyms just keep going. And then I want to just highlight and recap, because I think our speakers yesterday, and again Chris touched on it this morning, talked about this change in our shopper mobility and what I describe as the omni-channel frenzy. But to give you a bit of backdrop on that, and if we can test our new technology. Yeah, it would. Works. Our supply chains are becoming much more complex. We see the proliferation of outsourcing and offshoring, and those two things mean something different. We see the whole debate that's taking place between globalisation versus regionalisation, and where do we place our supply chains. We're seeing a whole shift in the priorities of our supply chain as our consumer behaviours shift. But fortunately, we're seeing things like the emergence of the Chief Supply Chain Officer, representing now that supply chain sits as a more strategic initiative in our organisations, not just an operational initiative. And we're seeing this thing that I call positional power. And I think Mark Miller describes it best. If any of you have read Mark Miller's recent book, Supply Chain Ecosystems, he describes it best when he talks about the relationship between Apple and Samsung. In one market, they are a supplier to one other party. In another market, party B now supplies party A. And of course, in other markets, they are the most frenzied competitors. And so we're now seeing a shift in those dynamics. And Apple is a great example, and I believe Paul Bradley touched on that yesterday. We're seeing the fact that we have twin engines. That's just failed me again. We'll go to the virtual reality if we can. Can we change the slide? Thank you. We're seeing the twin engines of our business being driven increasingly by two parts of our business. And hands up if there's any CFOs in the room. Any CFOs? If you're too shy to admit it, I apologise in advance. But increasingly our businesses are being driven by two parts. The Chief Supply Chain Officer, which I talked about a moment ago, and if we take the advent of plan, source, make and deliver, coupled with the Chief Marketing Officer's ambition, which is product, price, promotion and place, where we put our products. The central theme that brings that together is our logistics and distribution. And that's becoming increasingly more important as our businesses drive market growth. We're seeing things like the reshaping of our industry. And you can see there, if I'm not looking over my shoulder, up the screen there, rolling up as the deals that have just taken place this year as a highlight. And I know that many of you in the room are affected by those, both as employees of some of those companies, but also as customers as well. And those deals are going to significantly increase, both in size and in complexity. And you'll see that many of those deals that appear on that screen are actually not what we would consider to be traditional 3PLs. They're in the e-commerce space, they're technology providers. I was with a major parcel company in the Middle East on Thursday, and they're talking about their only interest in acquisition is not last mile, which is unusual for a parcel company, but they want to buy app companies that develop apps for shopping behaviours. So quite significant shifts. I talked about shifting priorities, the consolidation which I just touched on, the vertical specialisation that's taking place predominantly in the transport area. We're seeing investments into infrastructure. They remain high on the agenda for most organisations and governments, particularly in emerging markets. And we only have to look at some of the PPP deals that have been done in the likes of Vietnam as a testimony to that. I touched on just a moment ago, to set the landscape, the rising e-commerce and digitalisation of our businesses, and Chris just talked about it in a manufacturing environment. They are also now more prevalent in our deals, as I just said earlier. And I think that's something that's going to continue to affect our businesses, particularly if you're in the LSP space, as you look to bolt on capacity and reach further into the customer supply chain. And on the customer side, as increasingly, as we saw with Marcella's Singpost case study yesterday, our LSPs now being able to offer more virtual solutions that help us take us to market. The other area that we're seeing an increase in acquisitions, certainly in the inquiries that we field, is in niche, high value, highly specialised value add businesses that traditionally wouldn't be considered to be part of the logistics landscape. 50% of the time. So I'm not going to touch on all of these, but I do want to highlight some of these. So what are some of the things that are driving this acquisition? Well, the global economy is improving. There's a lot of confidence in the North American market, and there's a lot of cash that's sitting on the sideline, particularly in private equity firms. How many private equity firms do we have here, either in the property space or the pure LSP investment space? I know there was a couple yesterday. Hands up if you're in the space. David, you're over there. I can see one. 1, 2, 3. So, I can't recall a time where you go to logistics conferences in the last 5 years and you see more than one person in the room. And a few years ago, that was none. And of course, I think Zen was here from Affinity Capital yesterday. We're seeing the likes of the Asian LSPs. I'm working with an Asia, Singapore homegrown company at the moment who are investing in the US. And that's not a traditional investment ground for them. But when you ask them why they're investing, the strength of the Asian economy and the dollar makes acquisitions in more mature markets now possible, whereas 10 years ago that wasn't the case. And once again, cash on the sideline. We're seeing the express sector chase digitalisation and companies that support the capture of that shopper parcel and drive it back into the networks. We're seeing changing landscapes in the retail environment, which is driving the capacity building in the LSPs. And we're seeing the expansion into niche sectors, as I just talked about earlier. So most importantly, what we're going to face going forward in that merger acquisition space is continued capacity increasing from LSPs through acquisition. We're going to see consolidation of the major players further, and a good example is UTI and DSV just recently, Toll and Japan Post, and the names go on. And the Asia era is now. I talked about yesterday when I was on one of the panels, 4.9 billion people, up from 1.8, according to OECD. And 85% of that comes from Asia, from the economies that we all live and work in. I talked about the 500 million households that now have access to electricity and what that actually means. And their purchasing power, as they start to get connected to electricity, has a diminishing effect. It starts with the absolute essentials, and then it ends up in the consumer goods and the nice-to-haves, all of which drive our supply chains. We talked about the fact that half of our GDP for the globe will come from Asia by 2050. There's a recent survey done that came out just recently that said that of the top 50 cities, 16 of the more mature cities that we know that traditionally sit in the Americas and or in Europe will actually leave that list and be replaced by cities in Asia. In fact, by 2025, that will represent 20 Asian cities sitting inside that list. And I talked about, of course, yesterday, the 200 new cities in China that will have a population base of more than 1 million. What does that do for your supply chains? What does that do for our consumer base, the base that we're presently selling to? And we all know the story around the fact that Asia's been the factory to the world. Well, that's no longer the case. Asia is the factory for Asia, and many of those goods are remaining here in Asia for Asian consumption. And so we're right in the middle of that. We have this whole debate of global versus regionalisation. I saw an excellent presentation when I was in Argentina earlier this year from Unilever, and I think it was also highlighted at a conference last year here that, where do we put our manufacturing operations? And actually, should many of those decisions sit around those flags and those agreements that are on the screen in front of you? And where are the overlapping priorities on that? And so my panel, we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. We've got some experts on the panel that can give us a little bit of a feel for what that means. How does it affect our manufacturing priorities and where we place our manufacturing operations? And more importantly, should we be splitting our manufacturing orders into different locations to take advantage of these agreements? And you'll see that, as I talked about earlier, we have these overlapping agreements. And so if you're not across those, you need to be. And it's not all going to be about this wonderful thing called AEC. How many people have spent the last 12 months sort of understanding what AEC means for their business come the end of this year? Hands up. Okay, so a few of you in the room. How many people think that it's going to make a significant impact to your business come the end of this year versus 5 years' time? Anybody? There's a couple there. The reality is it will make an impact. These are some of the changes that you can see. There is a deadline. Are we ready for it? Are our governments ready for it? I'm going to touch on that in some of the panel. But increasingly, I think what's become more important and what will become more prevalent in the short term is the TPP. And there's a reason for that. And I won't go into the whole details that you can see on the slide. These slides are available to you afterwards if you want to get them. But if you're not looking at the impact of TPP as it becomes ratified, you need to be. Because there are a couple of significant differences between the trade agreements we've had today and AEC and TPP. One of which starts with this, my language, not theirs. Effectively, tariffs are removed on everything progressively over time unless there is an exception written into the agreement, which is the exact opposite of every free trade agreement we have today, which says, actually, tariffs are only removed on these items. So TPP assumes that tariffs don't exist on anything unless there's a specified exception, of which there are very few. And for those that there are exceptions on, there is a diminishing tariff level that is applied over a period of time. And so the baseline by where you start today is significantly different than the baseline that you start for the likes of AEC, which has the opposite of. And so the potential impact of that, and therefore the decisions that we make about where we place our operations, becomes increasingly more important under a TPP environment. The other thing that's important about TPP is its application. It applies across the entire gamut of the things that we do, including services, including dispute resolution, including competition, including labour and labour force movement. So there are no exceptions within a TPP environment. And of course, the timeline for its completion is some 5 years earlier than AEC. In fact, most governments are looking to have it completed by late 2016, which means that free trade agreement will be operational, impacting our supply chains long before AEC comes on our radar screens from a supply chain perspective. And what do we know about supply chain? Well, we know that they drive competitive advantage, and we know that that's increasingly so. We know that they have the abilities, and the CFOs that didn't put their hand up earlier, you can be pleased to know that supply chain is still one of the major drivers around whether our businesses perform or fail, particularly from a profit and loss perspective. Our speed to market is becoming increasingly more important. Our agility increasingly needs to be more flexible and nimble to take advantage of our changing shopper behaviour. And we need to be more collaborative. We're increasingly hearing this word collaboration, but as I said yesterday, the definition of collaboration is exactly that positional power that Samsung and Apple had in the example I gave earlier. The ability to work with your enemy for the greater good. So our 21st century supply chains, guys, can we just go to the virtual, please? Thank you. Our 21st century supply chains are going to be more complex. If we think they're complex now, we only have to listen to our speakers over the last 2 days and some of the themes that they're talking about to understand how they then feature into our businesses. Visibility, and Chris touched on this in his session, as did a couple of people yesterday, Joe in particular. Visibility is becoming increasingly more important in our supply chains. And the advent of cloud technology and apps makes that increasingly more easier to deploy bolt-on technology to give us that. So we need to be looking at those things if we want to create sustainable supply chains. And sustainability isn't just about us taking carbon credits and putting them in our back pocket or looking at green warehousing. It's about ensuring that we're in a market position where our consumers, who are now making decisions on whether they purchase from us or not, based on how we apply sustainability principles to our business. And so increasingly that's going to become much more part of our marketing and therefore our supply chains. And we only have to think about things like the Philippines disasters with typhoons and cyclones, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, to know that our supply chains need to become more agile and resilient to change and to deal with the volatility that is the norm. I'll highlight just a couple of the innovations, but I think Chris did a wonderful job when he talked about things like drones. I made an absolute fool of myself about 3 weeks ago at a conference on disruptive technology. I can't even recall where it was now, but and I share the same views as Chris on drones. I'm not a big believer that we're going to see 50,000 drones flying around New York City, picking my parcel up from the warehouse and dropping it to my front doorstep or bringing it to my desk. Sure, it's capable of that. But is that the best use of my asset? Probably not. And so I was silly enough to make that comment when someone asked me about the conference and how it was going at breakfast, at which point they gave me the example of where they were deploying drones in Singapore in a healthcare facility at night to fly up and down the bays and to photograph each bay, take that data and put it back into their system and do recognition of whether that bay was full or empty and look for exceptions. And that work had previously been done by workers over a 5-hour period with scissor lifts going up and down through the course of the night, so that when the staff came in the morning, there was an exception report that they then went and explored. The drone does it in 45 minutes, took out 5% of their labour cost. So I kind of stand a bit corrected on that. I think there is some applications for drones, but I think we certainly need to find out where that application sits and how it drives value. But on the screen there, we see the Walmart example of the Wave truck. Anyone heard of the Wave truck? Right? Who knows Walmart as a shopper retail company in the US? Hands up if you know Walmart as a retailer. How many know that that's one of the largest trucking firms in the US? Yeah, a couple here, right? We're taking 2,000 kilos of weight out of their new vehicles with their Wave technology truck trailers. Multiply that across their transport fleet, their cost of fuel consumption, their carbon usage, has a significant impact to their business. Locker boxes, driverless trucks. I saw a great headline the other day. It was fantastic. I got the news feed, and one part of the news feed said, driver shortages in New York City. The second headline said, Daimler trials driverless trucks on commercial highways in Germany. I thought, wow, there's a solution. And of course, we're seeing robotics. Down there in picture number 5 is, of course, Amazon's warehouse. And then there's infrastructure highway that is our supply chains. Can I just get these? No, we're good. Can anyone sort of recall back, and we're not all sort of, 16 in the room, but 2007, the world changed forever. Does anyone know what it is? What happened in 2007? January 2007 to be precise. Hands up if you know what happened in 2007 that changed the world forever. We've got one over there. Anybody else? Come on, think about it. You've all had coffee this morning, right? There's a few more faces in the room, so the cocktail hour couldn't have gone too long. Take a look down in front of you. How many people are sitting on their desk with one of these things? Mr. Limmers? Anybody else? Come on, who's got iPhones? Hands up if you've got an iPhone or a tablet or a smartphone. Right? 2007 wasn't that long ago, right? But in 2007, this bloke stood on stage in alto and said those words, "This will change everything." And I don't think that in the last 8 years, anybody said a statement that went more truer to life than that. I know Paul Bradley spoke yesterday, and he may have touched on this, and I apologise. I say I wasn't here yesterday morning, unfortunately, I was late in. But we have a whole industry that has come about because of this thing. Right? $77 billion. It's a big number, right? I think Amazon sales last year was 75 billion off memory. 268 million downloads. 46% of those downloads were paid apps. And I can order that today. Sanjay can get on his phone down here, he can order his product, he can pay for it online automatically, he can have it delivered to him online automatically, and he can be using it within minutes. And none of that touches our supply chain. $77 billion industry today. So just think about that for one moment. We have this internet frenzy. And it's that change in 2007 that brought about the frenzy that is e-commerce. We are only limited by the transformational power and size of these things. We're only limited by our ability to connect to the internet, our Wi-Fi capacity. I can't claim credit for this, but there's a new phenomena that's occurring which psychologists are now dealing with called nomobophobia. Right? It affects young people more than old people, fortunately, right? Because we didn't have phones. But as I said yesterday, the entry point for many of our consumers is no longer the desktop, right? Or the green screen as I grew up with the old cursors in it, right? And you had to write these strings before even something happened, if it happened at all. They're going straight to their entry point is the phone, which packs more power and more capacity than many of our desktops were back when we started to learn how to use them. 50% of all emails opened today are opened on a mobile device. 50%. 30 million devices, Chris talked about, connected to the internet. 42% of our searches are done on mobile devices. And yet for many retailers, we still don't have mobile capacity, mobile websites. So we have this massive e-frenzy taking place. And just to give you some scale of the size of that, take a look at the red section down there. That was the largest market in e-commerce 2 years ago. It's now been well and truly exceeded by Asia and will continue to be exceeded by Asia. Right? It will double in size by 2017. It's not the number that's staggering. It's the time frame by which that's going to occur that is the most staggering part of that equation. China alone, $1 trillion by 2019. Massive numbers. And all brought about by this thing that was developed and refined in 2007. I'm going to quickly go through this slide, but I'd made the point very clearly. Today's modern retailing and developed economy, right, relatively serves us well. There is nothing that I cannot hop in my car and go down to the local mall and purchase in a developed economy today. Okay? But in an emerging market, the proliferation of traditional retailing doesn't exist. Or if it does, it's still underdeveloped. We don't have big shopping malls. And in India, we still have limited multi-brand retailing. And so the entry point for growth for our retailers is going to bypass those traditional models completely because of the advent of our technology and our shopper mobility. And that presents an entirely new logistics challenge for Asia. How do we serve that? Every day is around our interaction with our consumer, where most of the touch points only occur when the driver hands over the parcel. And so our new shoppers are going to look like this. They're not going to look like the traditional shoppers. They're our customers. And they can shop anywhere they want. Whether that's Macy's, Harrods, they have the same ability to shop where we shop, and yet many of them have never walked into a shopping mall. In fact, many of them never sit in a community that even has a shopping mall. So I said yesterday, most of our customers don't even know the word omni-channel. For them, that's the new shopping experience. And for a lot of them, that is the shopping experience. They don't have any alternatives. And that's going to affect our physical operations. It's going to certainly affect our last mile delivery. And then we have this horrible subject that I call returns and reverse logistics and refunds. And once again, I'm going to skip through this in the interest of time, but one of the things I've asked my panel to talk about is, what does the future landscape look like? Because when you go from physical distribution centres to fulfilment centres, there's a real shift that takes place in the demographic of our parcel orders. We're now picking single items, multiple totes, and we're doing that within a relatively short time frame. So how does that B2B versus B2C environment change our physical operations? And then we have this last mile challenge in an e-commerce environment, which was talked about extensively yesterday. But the point I'll make here is three things. One, the only touch point for your customer is when that company hands over the parcel, much of which is outsourced. That's the first point where your customer physically engages in your business face to face. The second point, we've got a complexity around last mile that has to deal with urbanisation, it has to deal with rural deliveries, it has to deal with a whole bunch of different customer demands. I'm not at home, I'm in my office, please reship my parcel. Don't leave it under the doorstep, it needs a signature. My wife can't stay at home, she works. No, I'm not leaving my office now to accept it. And we do much of this for free. I'm not quite sure how we ended up there. Maybe some of the parcel companies in the room can take me later on and explain that to me, but I'm not quite sure how we went from paid shipping to completely free shipping, because we saw Marcelo's slide yesterday, right? And the increase by transactional conversion rapidly jumps by 1/3 the moment we offer free shipping. So there's perception of value. And of course it jumps by another third when we say, and you can return it for free. Which to me, and look, I'm just a mild-mannered entrepreneur, but that seems kind of ridiculous, right? I'm offering a whole bunch of value for nothing. And so we're having to see things like click and collect. in order to keep our sustainable costs down. And I love that number 4, right? Sarah, you're probably aware of this, and Ross, I know you are, but we're seeing the conversion of the traditional phone box, right? Now, my 15-year-old cousin, when she saw this, said, "What is that? Why would you go to a box on the street to use a telephone?" They've grown up in a world where that is the telephone. But they're converting these things, 15,000, they're converting to small item click and collect centres where you can go and collect your parcel from. And I think that's a magnificent use of existing infrastructure in a very highly dense environment. And we have this added complexity. We can just go to our virtual clicker. We have this added complexity of the returns, or as I like to call them, the terrible R's. And I'm not going to touch on all of those, but we have any number of reasons. And I think anyone from London or anyone from the UK here will correct me, but I think Tesco will accept any item back for 12 months. You can return it at any point after 12 months, or up to 12 months, free, for no reason whatsoever. No? There's no buyer remorse. I just didn't like it. I don't have to give you a reason why I didn't like it. It's yours back again. We have this thing where we've got to pick it up, return it. We've got to replace it, put it back on the shelf again. In many cases, we've got to go through and tidy the item up or refurnish it. And we've seen things like a really interesting story I heard in the US a few weeks ago, right? We're no longer buying one pair of shoes, right? We buy 5 pairs, we bring them home, we try them on. They look pretty good. I like that one. I'll buy that one. I'll send the other 4 back. I don't have to give a reason. And we're seeing advertised online now these shopper parties, and sorry for the ladies in the room, but it tends to get more laughs when I talk about this one, right? But, and my wife does this very, very well, right? I'll go and order 5 pairs of shoes, and I'll get a bottle of wine, and I'll go over to my girlfriend's place, and 5 of them will do the same thing, and we'll have a great night. We'll drink 5 bottles of wine, we'll have some cheese, we'll try on our 25 pairs of shoes, and I might order 1, but the next day, the 25 shoes gone back, they've had a great night, right? And meanwhile, the retailer's got to pick the return up, put it back on shelf, repitch it, scrub the wine off, or take the confetti out of the suit that you wore at the wedding the week before. And we do all that for free. I've never seen a business model like it. So I'm not quite sure what we're doing there, but that is our shopper. And so between a change in Asia, FTAs, e-commerce or omni-channel, whatever you want to call it, our supply chain is becoming more and more blurred. And all of that has an impact on our businesses today, and is only going to increase if we look at the stats that Chris put up earlier and the timeframes by which we're dealing with that. And so, I'm going to have to go virtual here. We're seeing increased industry activity in terms of consolidation, bolt-on capacity, things to think about. We're seeing FTAs, dynamic manufacturing. Think about that. Changing our landscape forever. These things don't go away, they don't get wound back. We can't stop the consumer growth of Asia now. $30 million devices, $1.7 trillion by 2020. Just talked about it. The impact of omni-channel supply chains and what that actually means. So what does this mean for your business? Well, as business leaders, forums like this become increasingly more important to understand and to learn and to adopt methodologies that are not the business practices we have today, but the business practices that are imperatives for our supply chains going forward. Our leadership skills, our talent needs to evolve to meet some of this demand. And most importantly, we need to understand what that is. We need to get ahead of the customer curve on this. And we need to understand what some of those possibilities may look like. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is punch straight into you not listening to me, but perhaps listening to our experts in the room, right? Because I don't have all the answers. If I did, I would be writing books like Mr. Miller. I'd like to invite my panelists.